Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashern Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This literally just happened recently, and honestly, I still haven't fully processed how creepy the whole situation actually was. Looking back now, there were warning signs everywhere. But at the time, I kept convincing myself there had to be a normal explanation for everything. It all started a few weeks ago with my dog suddenly acting strange at night. For context, my dog is one of the calmest, sweetest animals you could ever meet. He's an outside dog, but he's incredibly well cared for. He has a large covered crate setup with blankets, padding, food, water, and even an air-conditioned space nearby during hot weather. Normally at night, he happily walks into his crate without any issue at all. That's why his sudden behavior change stood out immediately. Every single night, he started refusing to go to sleep. Instead of settling down, he would stay outside roaming around the property barking non-stop into the darkness. Not playful barking either. This was aggressive, serious barking mixed with low growling. Sometimes he'd suddenly sprint across the yard like he was chasing something, before stopping near the tree line or barn and staring into the darkness. At first, I honestly thought it was probably coyotes. We live in a somewhat rural area, so animals wandering onto the property at night isn't unusual. Coyotes, raccoons, stray dogs, all of that happens occasionally. So even though the behavior lasted for weeks, I kept telling myself my dog was just reacting to wildlife nearby. Still, something about the way he acted felt different. He wasn't simply alert. He seemed genuinely disturbed. Sometimes he'd stare toward certain areas of the property for long stretches without moving, ears raised and body stiff. Other times he'd suddenly bark toward the barn or backyard fence like he knew something was there even when I couldn't see anything. But again, I ignored it. Until last night. It was pretty late already when I went outside to try getting him into his crate like usual. The air was warm and everything seemed quiet except for him pacing around the backyard. The second I opened the back door, I could tell he was already worked up about something. He kept staring toward the darker edge of the property near the barn while growling under his breath. I called him over and tried guiding him toward his crate, but he completely refused. He wouldn't even walk near it. Eventually, I figured maybe he just wanted to stay out because the weather was nice, so I gave up and went back inside. At that point, I still wasn't overly concerned. Then around 3 hours later, I woke up suddenly to him barking violently outside. Not normal barking. The kind of barking that instantly tells you something is wrong. Half asleep and irritated, I threw on my sandals and headed outside expecting maybe another animal had wandered into the yard again. The second I stepped out the back door, I saw him standing rigid in the backyard, facing the darkness near the barn. His entire body looked tense, fur standing up while he barked and growled non-stop at something I couldn't see. I called his name loudly. The moment I did, he immediately turned and sprinted toward me. And then I heard it. Something out in the darkness made this horrible garbled noise before running away. I still can't properly describe the sound. It didn't sound like an animal exactly, but it didn't sound fully human either. It was wet, choked, almost distorted somehow, like somebody trying to make noise while whispering through clenched teeth. The second I heard movement running away through the darkness, every bit of sleep disappeared instantly. My dog rushed straight to me and planted himself at my feet. At first I tried walking him toward his crate again, thinking maybe whatever scared him had left. But the second I started moving deeper into the yard, he physically blocked me. This dog is big and incredibly strong, and he shoved himself between my legs, refusing to let me continue forward. Every time I tried stepping around him, he pushed back harder while staring toward the darkness near the barn. That's when real fear started creeping in, because suddenly it felt less like he was refusing to go into the crate and more like he was trying to stop me from walking towards something. I finally listened to him. I backed up slowly, got us both inside, locked every door, and tried convincing myself I was overreacting. Still, I barely slept after that. The next morning around 8:30, I got up to feed my dog and bring him fresh water. The daylight made everything feel less threatening, but I couldn't stop thinking about the night before, especially that sound, and the way my dog acted. So I decided to walk around the property and see if maybe some animal tracks were nearby. At first everything looked normal. Then near the side of the yard I noticed footprints, human footprints, fresh ones. The tracks led away from the backyard area and directly toward the barn on my property. The second I realized they were human, my stomach dropped. The barn itself sits a little farther back on the property and isn't used much anymore except for storage. I usually don't go in there often because it's old, dusty, and mostly filled with random junk. I stood there staring at those footprints for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to immediately call the police. Another part still hoped there had to be some innocent explanation. Maybe someone wandered through the property accidentally. Maybe it was an old trail. Maybe I was being paranoid. So instead of calling anyone immediately, I waited most of the day, watching the barn from a distance to see if anything happened. Nothing did. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Late that afternoon, I finally walked toward the barn. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The entire area suddenly seemed too quiet, almost like the property itself was holding its breath. My dog refused to come with me all the way either. He stopped several yards away from the entrance and just stared nervously toward the building. That alone almost made me turn around. But I kept going. The inside of the barn smelled dusty and damp like old wood and hay. At first glance, nothing looked unusual, just shadows and storage clutter stacked everywhere. Then I looked upward toward the loft area, and my blood went cold. Someone had been living there, not just hiding briefly. Living there. There was an entire setup tucked away upstairs, a sleeping bag, food containers, water bottles, extra clothing, blankets, personal items. Whoever it was had clearly been staying there for a while without me knowing. I immediately backed out of the barn and called the police. The worst part was realizing my dog had known the entire time. For weeks he'd been trying to warn me that someone was coming onto the property every night, and I kept assuming it was coyotes. Police arrived pretty quickly after I called. They searched the property and eventually found the guy trying to leave through the woods near the edge of the land. To this day, I still don't know exactly how long he'd been staying there. That thought honestly disturbs me more than anything else. The idea that while I was sleeping inside my house, some stranger had been secretly living only a short distance away the entire time. And the really terrifying part? If it weren't for my dog refusing to stop barking every night, I probably never would have discovered him at all. Now, whenever my dog suddenly acts nervous or alert at night, I pay attention immediately. Because after this experience, I trust his instincts far more than my own. Over the last few years, I've had more than my fair share of strange experiences. I've seen things I still can't fully explain, from shadowy figures standing on empty roads to encounters that felt genuinely supernatural. Most of them left me unsettled for a while, but eventually I was able to brush them off and move on. This experience was different. Out of everything I've ever seen or experienced, this is the one that shook me the most. It wasn't because of a ghost or some unexplained paranormal event. It was because, for the first time in my life, I truly felt vulnerable. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. What makes it even stranger is that this happened very recently, only about a week ago. My girlfriend and I had planned a trip to Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio, during their Halloween Fright Nights event. We're both huge fans of horror attractions, haunted houses, and thrill rides, so it seemed like the perfect way to spend a weekend together. Unfortunately, we picked one of the worst possible weekends to visit. The park was absolutely packed. In fact, it ended up being one of the busiest weekends in Cedar Point's history. Everywhere we looked, people filled the walkways. Some ride lines stretched beyond 2 hours, and every attraction seemed overcrowded. We spent more time standing in lines than actually enjoying the park. After several hours, we were both frustrated and exhausted. Instead of wasting the rest of the evening waiting for rides, we decided to leave and find something else to do. While sitting in the parking lot, we started searching online for interesting places nearby. We weren't looking for anything specific at first, just something unique to explore before heading back to our hotel. That's when we stumbled across a collection of local legends and haunted locations around the area. One location immediately caught our attention. About 30 minutes from Sandusky is a road known as Gore Orphanage Road in Vermilion, Ohio. If you've never heard of it, it has become somewhat famous among ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts because of the stories surrounding it. According to local legend, an orphanage once stood in the area and was destroyed by a devastating fire. The story claims that numerous children and caretakers died in the blaze, leaving behind restless spirits that continue to haunt the land. Whether the story is completely true or not, countless people have reported strange experiences there over the years. The more we researched, the stranger the stories became. Nearby was a location known as Crybaby Bridge, where local folklore claims a woman threw her infant from the bridge many years ago. Visitors often report hearing the cries of a baby late at night. There were also stories about mysterious figures wandering through the woods, reports of a woman who was supposedly murdered and left hanging among the trees, and even rumors of occult groups conducting rituals deep within the forest. The internet was full of frightening stories. Of course, we assumed most of it was exaggerated. Every town has ghost stories. Every old road has urban legends. We figured this was just another collection of creepy tales meant to scare curious visitors. Our original plan was to visit after dark, but while reading online, we discovered that local police frequently monitored the area at night because so many people visited looking for paranormal activity. Since we didn't want any trouble, we decided to go around dusk instead. The plan seemed simple. We would park near the bridge, walk the half-mile trail to the location where the orphanage supposedly once stood, look around for a while, and then head back to our hotel with a few spooky stories to tell our friends. Nothing more. As sunset approached, we arrived at the area. Just before the bridge was a small dirt turnout where visitors could park. We pulled in, got out of the car, and locked the doors behind us. At first, everything seemed normal. We crossed the bridge without seeing or hearing anything unusual. The road stretched quietly ahead of us. On one side was a cornfield that seemed to go on forever. On the other side was a steep embankment covered with dense trees and undergrowth. It looked like a typical country road. The farther we walked, however, the stranger things began to feel. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It started faintly, but gradually became impossible to ignore. The air smelled strongly of smoke, as if someone nearby had recently started a fire. Neither of us could see any smoke. There were no houses nearby and no visible campfires. Yet the smell continued to grow stronger. Then something even stranger happened. As we approached the park area where the orphanage once stood, the temperature suddenly changed. Up until that point, the evening had been cool, probably somewhere in the low 50s. Yet within a matter of seconds, the air around us became noticeably warmer. Not slightly warmer, significantly warmer. The strange part was that we had entered a more heavily shaded area. Logically, it should have felt cooler beneath the trees. Instead, it felt as though we had stepped into an entirely different environment. Both of us stopped and looked at each other. "Did it just get warmer?" one of us asked. The other immediately agreed. Neither of us could explain it. Trying not to overthink things, we continued toward the park. As soon as we entered, we found several markers identifying where parts of the old orphanage had once stood. We stopped to take pictures and quietly looked around. The entire area felt unnaturally still. No birds, no distant traffic, very little wind, just silence. Then we heard it, knocking. A steady, rhythmic knocking sound echoed through the trees. Knock, knock, knock. At first, we thought it might be a woodpecker, but the sound continued with such consistency that it began making us uncomfortable. As we continued along the path, neither of us spoke much. We were both listening, watching, waiting. The deeper we ventured into the park, the more uneasy we became. Then something happened that made both of us stop instantly. We heard what sounded like a child screaming, not laughing, not playing. Screaming, the sound echoed through the woods and disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. My girlfriend froze. I froze. Neither of us said a word. We simply stared at each other. Eventually, after several seconds, we convinced ourselves it could have been an animal or perhaps a distant sound distorted by the trees. Even so, the experience left us shaken. A short time later, I smelled perfume. The scent appeared out of nowhere. It was incredibly strong, as though someone had sprayed it directly in front of me. The smell lingered for only a brief moment before fading away completely. It definitely wasn't my girlfriend's perfume. It smelled entirely different. Before I could process that, I heard another sound. Crunching leaves. The noise came from directly behind my girlfriend. It sounded exactly like someone walking toward us. We immediately stopped. I quickly turned around and snapped a photo in the direction of the sound. Nothing, no person, no animal, nothing visible at all. That was enough for us. Whatever was happening, neither of us felt comfortable staying there any longer. The atmosphere felt wrong. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. Darkness was approaching. Without discussing it much, we both agreed it was time to leave. As we walked back toward the entrance, we noticed two vehicles pulling into the park. Normally, that wouldn't have bothered us. But after everything we had experienced, even seeing other people made us uneasy. Part of it was nervousness. Part of it was simply because neither of us wanted an awkward encounter with strangers while already feeling on edge. We continued toward our car. That's when things took a turn from creepy to genuinely frightening. As we walked along the road, an older blue and white pickup truck suddenly came flying around a corner. The tires squealed against the pavement. The truck was moving far too fast for such a small road. It easily looked like the driver was doing more than 50 miles per hour in an area where 30 would have been pushing it. The truck swerved toward us and abruptly slowed down. The driver rolled down his window. He looked at me and laughed. "I almost just made a mistake," he said. Then he accelerated away, spinning his tires as he disappeared down the road. At first, I brushed it off. I figured maybe he was showing off. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was just another local trying to act tough. But my girlfriend reacted differently. The moment the truck disappeared, she began walking much faster. I could tell something about the encounter had bothered her immediately. About 2 minutes later, the truck returned. This time, it approached from the opposite direction. The driver slammed on his brakes beside us. Neither of us spoke. The man simply stared. As we continued walking, he slowly rolled his truck forward alongside us, closer and closer. Then he lifted one finger and motioned toward my girlfriend. "Come here." The gesture was small, but it instantly sent a chill through me. For the first time, I got a really good look at him. His appearance was unsettling. His hair was thin, greasy, and receding, plastered against his forehead. His smile looked unnatural. The expression on his face didn't feel friendly. It didn't feel normal. Something about him immediately triggered every survival instinct I had. I stepped between him and my girlfriend and waved him away. His expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared. He looked annoyed. Without saying another word, he slammed on the gas, spun his tires, and sped away across the bridge. The second he disappeared, we practically ran. Neither of us cared how ridiculous we looked. We just wanted to reach the car. When we finally got there, we jumped inside and immediately locked the doors. I started the engine and pulled away as quickly as possible. For several minutes, neither of us said a single word. We were both trying to process what had happened. The paranormal experiences in the park suddenly seemed insignificant compared to that encounter. As I drove, I constantly checked the rear-view mirror. Every few seconds, again and again. I was convinced that truck would appear behind us. I was terrified he had decided to follow us. The drive back to the hotel lasted about 45 minutes, and I spent most of it watching the mirrors. Even after we arrived safely, I couldn't completely relax. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he simply wanted to talk. Maybe he was intoxicated and acting strangely. Or maybe his intentions were much worse. The truth is, I'll never know. What I do know is that the situation could have ended very differently. We were fortunate that other people were nearby. We were fortunate it was still daylight. And we were fortunate that we trusted our instincts and left when we did. If we had gone later that night, when the roads were empty and the woods were completely dark, I'm not sure things would have turned out the same way. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost, a haunted road, or a paranormal legend. Sometimes the scariest thing is encountering a real person who makes every alarm bell in your mind start ringing at once. I've experienced strange things before, but nothing has ever shaken me quite like that drive back from Gore Orphanage Road. And if there's one lesson I learned from that night, it's simple. Always trust your instincts. Because sometimes the danger isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it's staring right at you from the driver's seat of an old pickup truck. This happened when I was around 10 years old, and even though many years have passed since then, I still remember every detail surprisingly well. It wasn't anything supernatural, and no one got hurt, but it was one of the first experiences that made me realize how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into something terrifying. At the time, I was just a kid who spent most of my free time playing video games. One evening, my aunt and cousins came over to visit. It was a pretty normal family gathering. The adults were talking in different rooms around the house, while all of us kids found ways to entertain ourselves. My cousin Avery and I were sitting in the living room playing Minecraft together. Back then, Minecraft was practically my entire world. Whenever I played it, I became completely absorbed in whatever I was building or exploring. Once I had the controller in my hands, everything else around me seemed to disappear. The adults were talking, laughing, and carrying on conversations throughout the house, but I barely noticed any of it. I was focused entirely on the game. At some point during the evening, my older cousin decided to take his younger brother outside. We had a swing set in the yard, and they went out there to play for a while. I vaguely remember seeing them leave, but I quickly went back to focusing on Minecraft. Time passed without me really noticing. The house felt comfortable and normal. Family members were scattered around talking, and Avery and I were completely invested in our game. Nothing seemed unusual. Then I heard a knock at the front door. It wasn't especially loud, but I happened to be sitting closest to the entrance. Somehow, despite being distracted by the game, I heard it clearly. Nobody else reacted. The conversations in the house continued, and no one seemed to notice the knock except me. Since my cousins had been outside, I immediately assumed one of them had come back in. Without giving it much thought, I got up from the couch and walked over to the door. Looking back, I probably should have checked first. But I was 10 years old. The possibility of something being wrong never even crossed my mind. I simply reached for the handle and opened the door. The second the door swung open, my stomach dropped. Standing on the front porch was a man I had never seen before. He looked like he was probably in his 50s. His appearance immediately sent a wave of fear through me. The first thing I noticed was the blood. There was blood on his face, there was blood on his clothes, there was blood everywhere. For a moment, I genuinely froze. As a kid, seeing someone covered in blood wasn't something I had ever experienced before. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions. I remember staring at him without saying a word. Everything seemed to slow down. The man looked exhausted and disoriented. His clothes were dirty and stained, and there were cuts on his face. The blood made the entire situation look much worse than it probably was, but as a child, all I could think was that something horrible had happened. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my chest. The man looked at me and spoke. His voice sounded strangely calm, considering how he looked. "I'm looking for the man who owns this house," he said. I don't remember exactly what I was thinking at that moment. I just remember feeling terrified. I barely managed to answer him. "Okay," I said quietly. Even speaking felt difficult. I slowly closed the door while trying not to panic. The second the door shut, I immediately locked it. I don't know why I did that. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fear. All I knew was that every alarm bell in my head was going off. As soon as the lock clicked into place, I ran to find my aunt. Trying to explain what I had just seen was difficult because I was so nervous. I told her there was a man outside covered in blood asking for the owner of the house. The moment she heard that, her expression changed completely. She started freaking out almost immediately. Her reaction caught everyone's attention. Within seconds, the relaxed atmosphere inside the house disappeared. The conversation stopped. People started asking questions. Everyone wanted to know what was going on. The commotion eventually caught the attention of my parents, who had apparently been talking in another room with my cousin. At first, I don't think they fully understood why everyone was panicking. Then, my aunt explained what I had said. A strange man, covered in blood, standing at the front door, looking for the homeowner. Suddenly, everyone was concerned. My dad immediately went to the front door to see what was happening. Meanwhile, I stayed well back from the entrance. I wasn't interested in seeing that man again. My imagination was running wild. Part of me thought he might be dangerous. Another part of me wondered if he had escaped from somewhere. As a 10-year-old kid, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I just knew that seeing someone covered in blood standing outside our house was one of the scariest things I had ever experienced. After a few minutes, my dad came back inside and explained what had happened. Thankfully, the reality was much less frightening than what I had imagined. The man wasn't a criminal, he wasn't trying to break into our house, and he wasn't there to hurt anyone. According to my dad, the man had been drinking. and had gotten into a car accident not far from our property. Apparently, he had crashed his vehicle roughly 100 feet away from our house. The blood on his face and clothes came from injuries he suffered during the crash. Disoriented, and likely still under the influence of alcohol, he had walked to the nearest house looking for help. Hearing the explanation made everyone feel a little better. The situation suddenly made sense. Still, knowing what had actually happened didn't completely erase the fear I had felt when I first opened that door. In my mind, that image was already burned into my memory. I can still picture it today. The unexpected knock, the quiet walk to the front door, the confidence that it was probably just my cousin coming back inside, then opening the door and finding a complete stranger standing there covered in blood. At 10 years old, it felt like something straight out of a horror movie. Even after everything was explained, I couldn't stop thinking about it. For several nights afterward, I found myself replaying the moment in my head. What if I had been home alone? What if the situation had been different? What if the man had actually been dangerous? Those questions stuck with me for a long time. The experience also taught me an important lesson that I still follow today. Before that night, I never thought twice about opening the front door. If someone knocked, I simply opened it. Now I always check first, whether it's through a peephole, a window, a security camera, or simply asking who is there. I never open the door without knowing who's on the other side. Most of the time, it's nothing. A friend, a delivery driver, a neighbor. But every time I hear an unexpected knock, I still remember that evening from years ago. I remember being 10 years old, walking confidently toward the front door, expecting to see my cousin standing there. Instead, I found a blood-covered stranger staring back at me. And for a few terrifying seconds, it was one of the scariest moments of my childhood. This happened in 2017, just 6 days after my 22nd birthday. Looking back, it should have been one of the happiest periods of my life. I had recently received the one thing I had wanted since I was a child, my very first dog. Growing up, I absolutely loved animals. Every time I visited a friend who had a dog or cat, I would spend more time with their pets than with them. Unfortunately, my family was never in a position to own one, so I spent most of my childhood wishing for a pet of my own. That finally changed when my boyfriend surprised me with a puppy shortly after my birthday. Her name was Reese's. From the moment I saw her, I was completely in love. She was a miniature poodle weighing only about 20 pounds, but she had enough energy to power an entire neighborhood. Every day felt like an adventure. I spent countless hours taking her on walks, exploring parks, and discovering new trails around New York City. At the time, my boyfriend and I lived in a shared townhouse near Riverside Park. Because the park was only a short walk away, it quickly became our favorite place to spend time with Reese's. We visited almost every day. I got to know many of the paths and open areas well, or at least I thought I did. One evening, my boyfriend had a work-related dinner party to attend, leaving me alone with Reese's for the night. I wasn't thrilled about it. I've never enjoyed being outside alone after dark, especially as a woman living in a large city. New York can be wonderful, but it can also be unpredictable. Even familiar places feel completely different once the sun goes down. That night, I felt particularly uneasy. In fact, every time I walked toward the front door to take Reese's outside, I found myself stopping. Something felt wrong. It wasn't a logical feeling. Nothing had happened. There was no reason to be afraid. Yet every instinct in my body seemed to be warning me not to leave the house. I remember standing near the door with my sandals in my hand, hesitating. The feeling was difficult to explain. It was as though something unpleasant was waiting outside. Eventually, However, I didn't have much of a choice. Reese's was scratching at the door and pacing around impatiently. She clearly needed to go outside. Trying to ignore my nerves, I slipped on my sandals, clipped on her leash, and stepped out into the night. Immediately, the atmosphere felt strange. The city wasn't silent, but the usual comforting sounds seemed distant. The darkness felt heavier than normal. Even with streetlights and nearby buildings, everything seemed unusually dim. I tried to convince myself I was simply being paranoid. After all, Riverside Park was a place I knew well. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We entered the park and began walking along one of the familiar paths. At first, everything seemed normal. I noticed a few groups of homeless individuals gathered beneath trees and near benches. Sadly, that wasn't unusual. New York City has always struggled with homelessness, and seeing people camped out in certain areas of the park wasn't uncommon. I kept walking. About 5 minutes into our walk, something happened. Without warning, Reese's suddenly began pulling on her leash with a strength I had never experienced before. At first I thought she had spotted a squirrel. Then I thought maybe another dog was nearby. But this was different. She wasn't pulling toward movement. She wasn't chasing anything. She seemed completely focused on reaching a specific destination. The leash became tight as she dragged me forward. Despite her small size, she was surprisingly determined. I called her name. Nothing. She kept moving. Then she pulled me up one of the park's hills. I stumbled after her, trying to keep up. The farther she went, the more confused I became. I didn't recognize where she was leading me. I've spent years exploring Riverside Park, yet this particular route felt unfamiliar. When we reached the top of the hill, she immediately headed toward a small wooded area. That struck me as odd. Riverside Park is massive, but heavily wooded sections aren't nearly as common as people might expect. Most areas are relatively open, with visible pathways and lighting. This area was different. Dense trees surrounded us. The farther we moved in, the darker everything became. Within moments, the glow from the nearest lamppost completely disappeared. It was pitch black. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. At that point, I was genuinely frightened. Every instinct told me to turn around, but Reese's refused to stop. She continued pulling me deeper into the darkness. Then, the terrain changed. We started descending a steep slope. The hill was almost ditch-like, dropping sharply into a lower section hidden beneath the trees. I had never seen anything like it before. Not in Riverside Park. Not anywhere nearby. The entire place felt disconnected from the rest of the city. As we made our way down, I became increasingly uncomfortable. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around us. The sounds of the city disappeared. The path behind us vanished. It felt like we had entered a completely different world. Finally, Reese's stopped. She lowered her head and began sniffing the ground. Almost immediately, I noticed a foul smell. It was strong enough to make me recoil. At first, I thought we had stepped in animal waste. The odor was overwhelming. Wanting to see where we were standing, I pulled out my flashlight. What the beam revealed is something I still think about years later. A few feet away sat a small child's potty training toilet. Beside it was a cardboard box positioned near the base of a tree. The sight alone was strange enough. Who would leave something like that hidden deep inside a dark wooded ditch? Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer. Inside the box was a large serrated knife. Next to it were several adult items. For a moment, I simply stared. The collection of objects made no sense. None of them belonged together. None of them should have been there. The entire scene felt bizarre and deeply unsettling. As I swept the flashlight around the area, I noticed something else. Scattered across the muddy ground were torn magazine pages. Many appeared to have come from adult magazines. The pages had been trampled into the mud and partially destroyed by moisture. What disturbed me wasn't just what they were, it was how they looked. The images seemed wrong somehow. The women in the photographs appeared surrounded by unusually dark backgrounds. The blackness seemed almost unnatural under the flashlight. Some pages had red markers scribbled across them. Several faces had markings drawn over their eyes. The red ink stood out sharply against the darkness of the photographs. Even now, years later, I remember the feeling that washed over me while looking at those pages. It wasn't ordinary fear. It felt like I had stumbled into a place I wasn't meant to find. A hidden corner of the city belonging to someone deeply disturbed. I've always considered myself a spiritual person. Whether people believe in energy or not, I've often trusted my instincts about places and people. Standing in that ditch, every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. The atmosphere felt wrong, oppressive, unhealthy, dangerous. Then I heard it. Footsteps, a distinct squishing sound in the mud. At first, I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind. Someone was moving nearby. I've told this story to many people over the years. Some suggested I imagined the footsteps because I was already frightened. But I know what I heard. I remember the sound clearly. In fact, I remember one specific detail more than anything else. The person was wearing flip-flops. I could hear the unmistakable flap of rubber striking skin with each step. Flap, step, flap, step. The sound echoed through the darkness. It wasn't boots. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. At that moment, every ounce of curiosity disappeared. I didn't care about the knife. I didn't care about the strange objects. I didn't care about understanding what I had found. I only cared about getting out. Immediately, I scooped Reese's into my arms. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Without looking back, I sprinted up the hill. Branches scraped against me. My footing slipped several times. I didn't care. I just kept running. The entire time, I was convinced someone was following me. I expected to hear footsteps speeding up behind me. I expected a hand to grab my shoulder. I expected something terrible to happen, but I never stopped to check. I ran until I reached the familiar pathways. Then I ran until I reached my street. Then I ran all the way to my front door. The second I got inside, I locked every lock available. For the rest of the night, I sat anxiously waiting for my boyfriend to return. Even though I was safely inside, the feeling of unease refused to leave. When he finally came home, I told him everything. The ditch, the knife, the strange objects, the magazine pages, the footsteps. To his credit, he took the story seriously. His immediate reaction was that we should report the knife. The next day, we returned to Riverside Park. We hoped Reese's would lead us back to the same location. She didn't. For hours, we searched. We walked through every trail we could find. We explored areas we had never visited before. Nothing, no ditch, no wooded section matching my memory, no cardboard box, no knife, nothing. The place seemed to have vanished. A week later, we tried again. Still nothing. We even asked people familiar with the park if they knew of a ditch-like area hidden among the trees. Nobody knew what we were talking about. Years have passed since that night, and I still don't know what bothers me more. The disturbing collection of items hidden in that dark hollow, or the fact that I never found the place again. The logical part of me tries to explain it away. Maybe I became disoriented in the dark. Maybe the location wasn't as unusual as I remember. Maybe fear distorted my memory. But another part of me remembers every detail with absolute clarity. The oppressive feeling before I even left my apartment. The way Reese's pulled me toward that spot. The strange objects hidden in the darkness, the footsteps approaching through the mud, and the overwhelming certainty that I needed to leave immediately. Whatever existed in that ditch, I still believe there was something deeply unsettling about it. Maybe it was nothing more than a hidden campsite. Maybe it belonged to someone struggling with mental illness. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But standing there that night, it didn't feel reasonable. It felt wrong. To this day, whenever I walk through Riverside Park, part of me wonders if I'll accidentally find that place again. And if I do, I'm not sure whether I'd feel relieved or terrified. All I know is that after all these years, I still think about that hidden ditch in the darkness. And sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what was making those footsteps. This is a story my mom told me several years ago. The events happened when she was around 8 years old and living in a rural part of Guatemala. I don't remember every single detail perfectly because she told me this story about 5 years ago, but the parts I do remember have always stuck with me. My mom grew up in a very poor family. She had either 4 or 5 sisters, and they spent most of their time playing outdoors. They didn't have many toys, electronics, or entertainment, so they would often make up their own games. Hide and seek was one of their favorites. At the time, they lived far from any major town or city. The area was mostly farmland, fields, and scattered homes. There weren't many people around, and the countryside stretched for miles in every direction. One evening during a storm, my mom and her sisters were outside exploring when they noticed a house in the distance. The house immediately caught their attention. It looked abandoned. From where they were standing, it appeared old and neglected, as though nobody had lived there for years. Curious as always, the sisters decided to go investigate. To a group of adventurous children, an abandoned house seemed like the perfect place to explore. As they got closer, the house looked even stranger. It wasn't a small shack or a broken-down cabin. It was actually a medium-sized house with several rooms. Some of the windows appeared to be boarded up, and the entire structure looked dark and lifeless. The sky above them was gray and threatening. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain hadn't fully started yet, but the storm was clearly moving in. Despite the weather, the sisters were excited. Without much hesitation, they entered the house. The moment they stepped inside, they were surrounded by darkness. Since the family was poor, none of them had flashlights or any kind of light source. The only light available came from occasional flashes of lightning outside. Every time lightning struck, it illuminated parts of the house for only a second before plunging everything back into darkness. The atmosphere inside felt eerie. Dust covered the floors. The rooms seemed empty. The boarded windows blocked much of the outside light. Even so, the children weren't scared, at least not yet. Like most kids, they quickly turned the creepy setting into a game. One of my mom's oldest sisters suddenly had an idea. "Let's play hide and seek," she suggested. The others immediately loved the idea. To them, an old abandoned house was the perfect place for it. Everyone agreed, except my mom. For some reason, she didn't feel comfortable wandering around the dark rooms. Instead of hiding, she decided to stay near the front entrance while the others ran off into different parts of the house. Soon her oldest sister began counting. The game started. My mom stood quietly near the doorway while flashes of lightning lit up the landscape outside. Every few moments, thunder rolled across the fields. The storm seemed to be getting closer. As she watched the darkness beyond the doorway, something caught her attention. During one flash of lightning, she thought she saw a figure in the distance. At first, she wasn't sure. The image had only appeared for a second. But when lightning flashed again, she saw it more clearly. Someone was walking toward the house. The figure appeared to be an elderly woman. Even from far away, there was something unsettling about her. She wasn't walking normally. She seemed to be limping. Slowly, unevenly, step by step, she moved closer. The sight immediately made my mom nervous. She couldn't explain why, but something about the woman felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation of the area. Maybe it was the storm. Or maybe it was the strange way the woman moved through the darkness. Whatever the reason, fear began to creep into her mind. Not wanting to stay alone, she went deeper into the house to find her sisters. After searching through a few rooms, she found her oldest sister looking inside a closet while continuing the game of hide and seek. My mom quickly told her what she had seen outside. At first, her sister didn't seem convinced, but eventually she agreed to come look for herself. The two girls carefully walked back toward the entrance and waited. For a few moments they saw nothing. Then another flash of lightning lit up the landscape. Both girls froze. The woman was still there, and she was much closer. There was no mistake now. Someone was definitely approaching the house. The figure appeared dark against the illuminated fields. Her slow, limping walk somehow looked even more disturbing than before. Neither girl said much. They simply stared. Then they hurried back inside. At this point, the game was forgotten. Finding the rest of their sisters suddenly became much more important. The two girls rushed from room to room, calling quietly for the others. The storm outside continued to intensify. Thunder crashed overhead. Lightning flashed through cracks in the boarded windows. One by one, they gathered the remaining sisters. Some were hiding under furniture. Others were tucked away in corners and closets. None of them understood why the older girls suddenly looked so frightened. Once everyone was together, they decided to leave immediately. The abandoned house no longer felt like a place for adventure. Now it felt like somewhere they needed to escape from. The sisters hurried toward the front door, one after another. They exited the house and began moving away as quickly as possible. My mom happened to be the last one outside. As she stepped through the doorway, lightning flashed across the sky once again. For a brief second, the entire area became visible. What she saw terrified her. The old woman was now extremely close. According to my mom, she was only about 15 feet away. Close enough to clearly see. Close enough that there was no possibility of mistaking her for something else. The woman was dressed entirely in black. She wore dark clothing from head to toe. On her head was a pointed hat. In one hand, she carried what appeared to be a long stick. The image looked like something straight out of a folklore story. For a moment, my mom froze. Then panic took over. As she ran past the woman to catch up with her sisters, she heard the old woman speaking, but she couldn't understand the words. The sounds didn't make sense to her. It was as if the woman was muttering gibberish or speaking in a language she couldn't recognize. The voice only added to her fear. Without looking back, my mom ran. All of the sisters ran. They sprinted across the fields and back toward their home as fast as they could. None of them wanted to stay near that house for another second. The storm raged around them as they fled. Thunder echoed overhead. Lightning flashed behind them. Yet none of the girls stopped running. Eventually, they reached home safely. Only then did they begin talking about what they had seen. Even years later, my mom remained convinced that the woman was not an ordinary person. She believed she had encountered a bruja, which is the Spanish word for a witch. Whether it was truly a witch, an elderly woman wandering the countryside, or simply a frightening misunderstanding, I have no way of knowing. What I do know is that my mom always told the story with complete seriousness. Every time she described the old woman's slow limp, her black clothing, the pointed hat, and the strange voice muttering in the darkness, she seemed genuinely unsettled by the memory. The thing that always stayed with me wasn't just the appearance of the woman. It was how she kept getting closer every time the lightning illuminated the landscape. First she was far away. Then she was noticeably closer. Then she was standing only a few feet from the house. For a group of children trapped inside an abandoned building during a thunderstorm, that must have been absolutely terrifying. To this day, whenever I think about the story, I can easily imagine the scene. An old abandoned house, a violent storm, children playing hide and seek in complete darkness, and somewhere out in the fields, a limping woman dressed entirely in black, slowly making her way toward them, with every flash of lightning. Whether she was truly a witch or not, it's easy to understand why my mom never forgot that night. A few years ago, I found myself home alone for several days while my parents were away. At first, I thought it was going to be one of the best experiences ever. As a kid, I had always dreamed about having an entire house to myself. No rules, no one telling me to go to bed, and complete freedom to do whatever I wanted. So when my parents left, I was excited. The first day was pretty normal. I watched TV, played games, and enjoyed the quiet. But on the second night, I decided to do something I had always wanted to do. Instead of sleeping in my own room, I moved into my parents' bedroom. The main reason was simple. They had air conditioning. My room didn't. I figured I would spend the night watching movies, eating snacks, and enjoying the cool air. To me, it felt like I was finally living out a childhood dream. As the evening went on, I started singing along to music and random songs that popped into my head. Since nobody was home, I sang as loudly as I wanted. Around midnight, I suddenly remembered something my parents used to tell me. My mom is a very religious person, and throughout my childhood she often repeated certain beliefs about nighttime. She would tell me not to whistle after dark, not to cut my nails at night, not to cry unnecessarily, and especially not to sing late at night. According to her, these things could attract unwanted spirits. Of course, I never really believed any of it. To me, they were simply old superstitions. So despite remembering her warnings, I kept singing anyway. Nothing happened, at least not immediately. After a while, I got bored and stopped singing. Instead, I spent the next few hours watching horror content online. One video turned into another, then another. Soon I found myself watching urban explorers investigating abandoned buildings and supposedly haunted locations. Before I knew it, hours had passed. The clock was approaching 4 in the morning. At that point, I started feeling hungry. I decided to head downstairs and make myself some noodles. The moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me instantly. The odor was so foul that it almost made me stop walking. The closest thing I can compare it to is a garbage bin that hadn't been emptied for years. It was rotten, heavy, overpowering. For a moment, I assumed the trash needed to be taken out. I hadn't emptied it in a couple of days, so that seemed like the most logical explanation. Still, something about the smell felt unusual. It was far stronger than it should have been. Even so, I tried not to think about it. I walked into the kitchen and started preparing my noodles. The house was completely silent. The only sounds were the occasional bubbling of water and the faint hum of appliances. Then I heard something outside. A noise came from the front yard. It wasn't particularly loud, but it was enough to make me stop what I was doing. The silence made every sound feel amplified. I turned off the stove and carefully walked toward the nearest window. Trying not to make any noise, I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. I scanned the yard. Nothing. No people. No animals. No movement. Everything appeared completely normal. Feeling a little foolish, I returned to the kitchen and finished cooking. Once the noodles were ready, I carried them to the dining room and sat down to eat. As I ate, I continued watching horror videos and scary stories on my phone. Looking back, that was probably not the smartest thing to do while home alone at 4 in the morning. The more horror content I watched, the more aware I became of every little sound around me. The house suddenly felt much larger, much emptier, much darker. Then I noticed something strange. I was getting cold. Very cold. At first I assumed it was because I was tired, but then I remembered something. I hadn't turned on any fans downstairs. In fact, the only air conditioning running in the entire house was upstairs in my parents' room. There shouldn't have been any reason for the dining room to feel cold. Yet I could feel the temperature dropping. A chill seemed to settle around me. I tried to ignore it and continued eating. That's when I saw something. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a flash of white movement beside one of the nearby chairs. It was quick, so quick that I couldn't tell exactly what it was. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my tired brain was playing games with me. Whatever it was, it frightened me enough to immediately lose my appetite. I quickly finished eating, cleaned up, and headed upstairs. The entire time, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't alone. Back in my parents' room, I settled into bed. For some reason, I decided not to close the door completely. Instead, I left it slightly open, just enough to see into the hallway. At the time, it felt comforting. The hallway light was still on, and I liked being able to see outside the room. Hours continued to pass. By then it was around 5:40 in the morning. I was exhausted. My eyes felt heavy. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept staring at the partially open door, wondering when my parents would finally return home. Eventually, I curled into a ball beneath the blanket. I pulled it over my head, leaving only a small opening so I could breathe and peek out into the hallway. The room was quiet, painfully quiet. Then it happened. Something moved past the doorway. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The movement was slow, silent, but unmistakable. I remember seeing what appeared to be an incredibly tall figure walking across the opening of the door. The image lasted only a moment, yet it felt burned into my memory. The figure seemed unnaturally tall. From what I could make out, its skin looked pale and discolored, almost like decaying flesh. I immediately felt chills run through my entire body. My heart started racing. I froze beneath the blanket. Part of me desperately wanted to believe it was my imagination. After all, I had been awake all night. I had spent hours watching horror videos. I was exhausted, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I had actually seen something. Before I could convince myself otherwise, another sound broke the silence. It came from downstairs. A noise, a movement, something I couldn't tell exactly what it was. I just knew I heard it. The sound seemed to echo through the house. At that moment, I remembered that almost every light in the house was turned off. The only light still on was the one outside my parents' room near the staircase. Everything else below was swallowed by darkness. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I was terrified. I stayed completely still beneath the blanket. Every second felt like a minute. Every small creak of the house made me jump. I kept staring at the doorway, waiting to see if the figure would return. Thankfully, it never did. Eventually, the sky began to brighten. Morning arrived. The darkness slowly disappeared, and not long afterward, my parents finally came home. The second they walked through the door, I told them everything. I told them about the terrible smell, the noise outside, the sudden coldness downstairs, the white movement near the chair, the tall figure that passed the doorway, and the sounds I heard later in the house. To my disappointment, they didn't take it very seriously. They laughed and told me I had probably scared myself. According to them, I had stayed awake all night watching horror videos, and my tired imagination had likely filled in the rest. They even joked that I was trying to prank them. Maybe they're right. Maybe exhaustion played a role. Maybe watching scary videos until dawn wasn't the best idea. But the fear I felt that night was very real. Years have passed since then, and I still live in the same house. Nothing like that has ever happened again, yet that experience changed me. Before that night, I had no problem staying home alone. Now I hate it. Before that night, I never thought twice about leaving a door open. Now I lock everything. The front door, the windows, my bedroom door, even the bathroom door sometimes. I know there are probably logical explanations for everything that happened, but every now and then, when I'm awake late at night and the house is completely silent, I find myself thinking back to that night. The foul smell, the freezing air, the movement near the chair, and the impossibly tall figure that silently crossed my doorway just before sunrise. To this day, I still don't know what I saw. And honestly, part of me doesn't want to find out. This story isn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, but it's one of the few experiences that has stayed with me over the years because of how strange and sad it felt. Growing up, my family didn't have a lot of money. We were low income, and to help cover rent and bills, my parents often rented out rooms in our apartment to different people. Because of that, there was almost always someone new living with us. Over the years, we met all kinds of people. Some were friendly and kept to themselves. Others were difficult to live with. A few struggled with drug addiction, while some had serious personal problems that sometimes created tension in the house. As kids, my sister and I got used to seeing strangers come and go. It was simply part of life for us. One family that stayed with us consisted of a mother, a father, and their adult son. Out of all the people who ever rented a room from us, their son was probably one of the nicest. He wasn't perfect. He openly admitted that he had made mistakes in his life and struggled with things he wasn't proud of. But despite that, he always treated us with kindness. He would talk to us whenever he saw us around the apartment. He never acted rude or intimidating. In fact, he often tried to encourage us. I remember him telling us to stay away from drugs and avoid making the same mistakes he had made. He would tell us that we had opportunities ahead of us and that we should make better choices than he did. Looking back now, I realize he was genuinely trying to help. He didn't want other kids to end up going down the same path he had. One thing I remember clearly is how generous he could be. Before everything happened, he gave my little sister a huge bag of Takis just because he knew she liked them. He also gave my cousin his skateboard. Those might seem like small things, but to us, they meant a lot. He was the kind of person who didn't have much, yet still tried to give what he could. That's why what happened next shocked everyone. One day, we learned that he had been stabbed and killed. I was still young when it happened, but I remember how suddenly everything changed. The apartment felt different afterward. His parents were devastated. The atmosphere in the house became heavy and sad. Everyone seemed quieter. Even though he wasn't a member of our family, his death affected everyone who knew him. After he died, strange things began happening around the apartment. At first, we tried to ignore them. My sister and I often stayed up late, sometimes talking, watching TV, or just lying awake when everyone else was asleep. During those late nights, we would occasionally hear footsteps. The sounds seemed to come from the hallway or the ceiling above us. The strange part was that they usually happened when nobody should have been awake. Everyone else in the apartment appeared to be sleeping. The noises weren't loud enough to be alarming, but they were noticeable. Sometimes it sounded like someone slowly walking through the hallway. Other times it sounded like footsteps moving overhead. Whenever we heard them, my sister and I would look at each other, wondering if we had both heard the same thing. Another strange thing involved a cabinet. Before his death, there was a cabinet where snacks were stored. As far as I can remember, it usually stayed closed. Nobody paid much attention to it because there was no reason to. But after he passed away, the cabinet would occasionally be found open. At first, people assumed someone had simply forgotten to close it. Then it happened again and again. The cabinet seemed to open by itself far more often than it ever had before. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe someone kept forgetting to shut it. But because of everything that had happened, it felt unsettling. The footsteps in the cabinet became small mysteries that nobody could really explain. The timing made it difficult not to think about him. For a while, those strange occurrences continued. Then, eventually, his parents decided to move away. Considering everything they had gone through, nobody blamed them. The apartment probably held too many painful memories. After they left, something interesting happened. The sounds stopped. The footsteps that my sister and I used to hear late at night seemed to disappear. The strange activity around the cabinet also seemed to end. Life gradually returned to normal. To this day, I don't know if any of it was paranormal. There could have been completely ordinary explanations for everything. Apartments make noises. Buildings settle. Cabinets wear out. People sometimes hear things differently when they're grieving or thinking about someone who has passed away. But part of me still wonders. The timing was strange. The noises started after his death and seemed to stop after his family moved away. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. What I remember most, though, isn't the footsteps or the cabinet. It's him. I remember the way he treated people. I remember him giving my sister that giant bag of Takis. I remember him giving my cousin his skateboard. I remember him warning us not to make the same mistakes he had made. He knew the consequences of those choices better than most people, and he genuinely wanted us to have a better future. That kindness is what has stayed with me all these years. So when I think about those strange sounds in the hallway, I don't really feel scared. If anything, I feel sad, because behind the mystery was a real person who lost his life far too soon. And whether those footsteps were paranormal or not, they always seemed to remind us that someone kind, someone who cared about the kids around him, was suddenly gone. That's the part of the story I'll never forget. I've always had a fascination with the paranormal. Ever since I was young, I spent countless hours reading books, watching documentaries, and listening to stories about hauntings, ghosts, and unexplained phenomena. The people closest to me knew this about me, so it wasn't unusual for someone to approach me with a strange story or ask for my opinion on something they couldn't explain. Part of that interest came from the house I grew up in. The home was locally known for being haunted. It wasn't the kind of haunting you see in horror movies. There were no levitating objects, spinning heads, or dramatic exorcisms. Instead, it was a collection of small but persistent experiences that happened often enough to make you question reality. Doors would occasionally open on their own. Footsteps could sometimes be heard when nobody else was home. Objects would disappear and reappear in places they shouldn't have been. Nothing was ever threatening, but it was strange enough that everyone who lived there eventually accepted that something unusual was going on. Because of that upbringing, I became difficult to scare. Most paranormal stories didn't impress me much. I've always believed that there is usually an explanation, even if it isn't immediately obvious. Several years ago, a young woman I knew through church approached me after a service. She seemed nervous. After talking for a few minutes, she finally told me why she wanted to speak with me. According to her, she believed her home was haunted. She had heard about my interest in the paranormal and wondered if I would be willing to visit her house and listen to what had been happening. Naturally, I agreed. I expected to arrive at some old Victorian house with creaking floorboards, dark hallways, and a history stretching back over a century. Instead, when I arrived, I found something completely different. Her home was a relatively modern, single-wide mobile home. Nothing about it looked particularly unusual. There was no dramatic atmosphere, no abandoned cemetery nearby, no stories about previous owners dying under mysterious circumstances. At first glance, it looked like a perfectly ordinary place. The woman welcomed me inside and began explaining what she had been experiencing. According to her, the activity mostly happened at night. She said that whenever she looked down the hallway toward the living room, she would sometimes see what appeared to be a little girl. The figure would be playing quietly in the room. Sometimes she would catch only a glimpse. Other times she claimed she could watch the girl for several seconds before the figure disappeared. The descriptions were detailed, too detailed. As she spoke, I listened carefully. The longer we talked, the more I began to feel that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't that I thought she was lying. In fact, I believed she genuinely thought she was experiencing something. But there was a feeling that she wasn't telling me everything. Whenever I asked certain questions, she would become uncomfortable. She would hesitate. Sometimes she would change the subject entirely. The story seemed incomplete. After enough conversation, it became obvious that there was something she was holding back. Eventually, the pressure became too much. She broke down crying. For several minutes, she struggled to compose herself. Then, she finally told me the truth. What she revealed had nothing to do with ghosts. At least, not at first. She explained that her marriage had become deeply troubled. Behind closed doors, she and her husband were trapped in a toxic and volatile relationship. Arguments frequently escalated into violence. The situation had become dangerous long before she ever spoke to me. Then she told me something she had never shared with anyone else. Shortly before the experiences began, she had discovered she was pregnant. She hadn't yet told her husband. One night, during an argument, he became physically aggressive. According to her, the assault was severe enough that she lost the pregnancy. The experience devastated her. But instead of seeking help or telling anyone what had happened, she kept it secret. She never told her husband about the pregnancy. She never told him about the miscarriage. She carried the burden entirely by herself. For months, she lived with the grief, guilt, anger, and trauma in silence. As she described the events, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. By the time she finished, I wasn't thinking about ghosts anymore. I was thinking about psychological trauma. I was thinking about guilt. I was thinking about unresolved grief. When she finally stopped talking, I gently shared my thoughts. I told her that I wasn't convinced a spirit was haunting her home. Instead, I believed she was being haunted by something much more personal. Her conscience, her grief, her pain. The image of the little girl seemed symbolic of everything she had been trying to suppress. Every secret, every regret, every memory she had refused to confront. I explained that trauma has a way of finding expression. Sometimes people experience vivid dreams. Sometimes they experience anxiety. Sometimes guilt manifests itself in ways that feel incredibly real. I suggested that before looking for paranormal explanations, she needed to address the truth she had been carrying for so long. Most importantly, I told her she needed to tell her husband what had happened. Not because it would necessarily solve everything, but because secrets, have a way of growing larger the longer they remain hidden. At first, she resisted the idea. The thought terrified her. But eventually, after a long conversation, she agreed. Several days later, she decided to tell him. I wasn't present for that conversation. Everything that happened afterward was relayed to me later. According to her, when she finally confessed the truth, her husband was completely shocked. He had never known she was pregnant. He had never known she had lost the baby. And he had never realized the weight she had been carrying all that time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then something happened that neither of them expected. After hearing the entire story, her husband became visibly shaken. His face reportedly went pale. He sat silently for a few moments before finally speaking. Then he said something that sent chills down her spine. I see her sometimes too. According to him, there had been nights when he thought he saw a little girl out of the corner of his eye. He had dismissed the experiences and never mentioned them to anyone. He assumed his mind was playing tricks on him. As a result, he kept the experiences entirely to himself. Now, sitting there listening to his wife's confession, he realized the figure she had been describing was identical to what he had occasionally seen. When she told me that part of the story, I honestly didn't know what to think. Part of me still believed there was a psychological explanation. After all, guilt affects people in powerful ways. Trauma can shape perception. The human mind is capable of extraordinary things. But another part of me couldn't ignore the coincidence. Neither of them had spoken about the little girl before, yet both claimed to have seen the same figure. Was it shared guilt? Shared trauma? A subconscious manifestation of something they both carried? Or was it something neither of them could explain? To this day, I don't know. What I do know is that after the truth came out, the sightings eventually stopped. Whether that happened because a spirit finally moved on, or because two people finally confronted a painful secret, I'll leave for others to decide. But after years of hearing paranormal stories, this remains one of the few experiences that genuinely stayed with me. Not because of the possibility of a ghost, but because it reminded me that sometimes the things that haunt us most aren't supernatural at all. Sometimes the most powerful hauntings come from the secrets we carry, the guilt we bury, and the truths we refuse to face. And occasionally, when those truths finally come to light, the ghosts disappear. The police arrived at almost the same time. Even after they got there, I remained nervous. I stayed close to my mom while the officers began searching the house. Room by room, they checked every part of the property. At first, they didn't seem to find anything. Then, they discovered something I never would have expected. Someone had actually been inside the house. Hidden in one of the closets was a homeless man. I was shocked. My mom was shocked. The entire situation suddenly became much more frightening. According to what the officers learned, the man had apparently been living inside the closet for around 2 days. 2 days. The thought still gives me chills. That meant he had likely been inside our house while we were going about our normal lives, completely unaware of his presence. The police questioned him and eventually discovered that he had supposedly planned to stay there for about a week before moving on to another house. I don't know how he got inside. I don't know how long he had been watching us. And honestly, I don't want to know. As a child, those questions were terrifying. Even now, the idea that a stranger had secretly been living inside our home is unsettling. The police eventually removed him from the house. When I was 8 years old, I experienced something that completely changed how I felt about being home alone. At the time, my entire family was planning to visit my grandmother's house. Normally, I would have gone with them, but for some reason I stayed behind. Looking back now, It doesn't seem like a big deal, but as an 8-year-old child, the idea of being alone in the house terrified me. I remember feeling nervous the moment everyone left. The house suddenly felt much larger and much quieter than usual. Every little sound seemed louder when there wasn't anyone else around. Thankfully, my mom knew I was scared. Before leaving, she promised she would call me regularly to check on me and make sure I was okay. True to her word, she called about every 15 minutes. Each time the phone rang, I felt a little better. Hearing her voice reassured me that everything was fine and that my family would be back soon. For the first hour or so, I tried to distract myself by watching television. I sat in the living room, focusing on whatever happened to be on TV and trying not to think about how empty the house felt. Every so often, my phone would ring and my mom would ask how I was doing. I always told her I was fine, even though I was still nervous. Then, during one of her calls, she told me something I didn't want to hear. She said it would still be another 3 hours before they returned home. I remember feeling disappointed immediately. Up until that moment, I had assumed everyone would be back much sooner. 3 more hours felt like forever to an 8-year-old. Still, I didn't have much choice. I hung up the phone and went back to watching television. I tried to relax and convince myself that everything would be okay. For a few minutes, nothing unusual happened. The house was quiet. The TV played in the background. Everything seemed normal. Then, I heard it. A sound coming from somewhere else in the house. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I muted the television and listened carefully. That's when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a closet door opening. Slowly, then closing. The noise was clear. I knew exactly what it sounded like because I had heard those closet doors open and close hundreds of times before. For a moment, I sat completely still. My heart started beating faster. I immediately tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind. But that didn't make any sense. Every window in the house was closed. There wasn't any strong breeze outside. Nothing should have caused a closet door to move on its own. The realization made me panic. As an 8-year-old child sitting alone in a quiet house, hearing a door open by itself was one of the scariest things I could imagine. I suddenly felt vulnerable. The silence that followed seemed even worse. I kept staring toward the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. The longer I sat there, the more frightened I became. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran into the room where I had been sitting and locked the door behind me. Even though it was probably just a normal bedroom door, locking it made me feel slightly safer. I climbed onto the bed and immediately called my mom. The second she answered, she could hear the fear in my voice. I explained what I had heard. I told her the closet door had opened and closed by itself. I told her I was scared. Unlike many parents who might have assumed it was just a child's imagination, my mom took it seriously. She immediately told me to stay where I was and said she was coming home right away. Then, she did something that surprised me. She called the police. At the time, I didn't fully understand why. I just stayed locked in the room, clutching the phone and waiting. Those 15 minutes felt longer than any 15 minutes of my life. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every little noise sounded suspicious. I kept imagining someone walking through the hallways outside my room. I remember staring at the locked door, hoping nobody would try to open it. Eventually, I heard activity outside. Cars arrived. Voices, movement. A short time later, my mom reached the house. Out of the entire family, she was the only one who came back immediately. After that, I never heard anything else about him. I don't know what happened to him afterward. I don't know where he went. And I've never asked my mom for more details. Some things are probably better left unknown. What I do know is that the experience had a huge impact on me. Until that day, I thought my fear of being home alone was mostly in my head. I assumed I was simply being an anxious kid. But after learning that there had actually been a stranger hiding inside our house, my fear suddenly felt justified. For a long time afterward, I was nervous whenever I heard unexpected sounds around the house. Closet doors, footsteps, creaking floorboards. Everything made me wonder if someone was there. My family took the incident seriously too. In fact, after that day, I was never left home alone again. Not when I was that young. My parents decided it wasn't worth the risk. Looking back, I can understand why. Out of all the scary stories people tell about ghosts, monsters, or strange noises in the dark, this experience was frightening for a different reason. There was no paranormal explanation, no ghost, no mystery. The truth was much worse. There really was someone inside the house. And for an 8-year-old child sitting alone, that reality was far scarier than anything I could have imagined. This happened during my senior year of high school, shortly after my friends and I got our driver's licenses. Like most teenagers who had just gained a little freedom, we were constantly looking for places to explore late at night. There was one particular park we loved visiting. It wasn't a typical neighborhood park with playgrounds and picnic tables. This place was huge and heavily wooded. Massive rocks and stone formations were scattered throughout the area, some partially buried in the ground, and others creating narrow passageways and crevices that you could walk through. It felt more like a natural wilderness than a public park. The most interesting part, though, was hidden deep in the back. If you followed the trails far enough, eventually you would reach a large area of sand dunes. The dunes were surprisingly isolated, far from any houses, roads, or sources of light. Getting there required about a 30-minute walk from the main entrance. At night, it felt like an entirely different world. On this particular night, 3 of my friends and I decided to visit the park again. It wasn't our first time there. In fact, it was our second trip to the dunes. The difference this time was that we brought another friend who had never been there before. His parents were much stricter than ours, and he had a firm curfew. He was supposed to be home by 1 a.m., which meant we couldn't stay out too late. At least that was the plan. We arrived at the park and started making the long walk toward the dunes. Everything felt completely normal. The weather was perfect. The sand still held a bit of coolness from the evening air. Above us, the sky was incredibly clear. Because the dunes were so far away from city lights, the stars seemed brighter than usual. It was one of those nights where you could stand still and just stare at the sky for minutes at a time. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Nothing seemed strange. Nothing felt wrong. I remember checking my phone at one point, both to look at Snapchat and to take a few pictures. The time was around 11:30 p.m. I remember that clearly because I specifically checked before taking photos. At that point, we still had plenty of time before our friend's curfew. Eventually, we decided to explore deeper into the dunes. There was a place we had discovered during a previous visit that we thought was really cool. Buried in the sand was a massive concrete block. None of us knew why it was there. It looked like some kind of old structure or foundation that had become partially swallowed by the dunes over time. The surface was covered in small divots and depressions. Whenever it rained, water would collect inside them and remain there long after everything else had dried. When we arrived, many of the indentations still contained water. Even better, the puddles were full of frogs. Like a bunch of bored teenagers, we immediately became obsessed with catching them. For what felt like maybe 30 minutes, we chased frogs around, laughed at each other, and enjoyed the night. Nothing unusual happened. No weird sounds, no strange lights, nothing that would make us think this story was going to end differently. Then I decided to take another picture. The moon was reflecting beautifully off the water trapped inside the concrete structure, and I thought it would make a great photo. I pulled out my phone and froze. The screen showed 2:51 a.m. For a second, I thought my phone had glitched. There was no way that could be right. We had arrived at the dunes around 11:30. There was absolutely no chance we had spent over 3 hours there. At least it didn't feel that way. I immediately looked at one of my friends. "What time is it?" I asked. Before even checking his phone, he looked up and said, "Bro, my mom called me." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. I asked him again, "What time is it?" Finally, he checked his phone. His expression changed instantly. 2:51, the exact same time. My stomach dropped. Everyone suddenly stopped talking. The realization hit us all at once. Our friend had missed his 1 a.m. curfew by nearly 2 hours. Even stranger, he claimed he never heard his phone ring. That made no sense. He had an iPhone, just like me. His phone always vibrated and made noise whenever someone called. There was no way his mother would have waited that long without trying repeatedly, and there was definitely no way he could have missed every call. The whole situation felt wrong. The more we thought about it, the less sense it made. We tried to retrace everything we had done. We had walked to the dunes, we had explored, we had caught frogs. That was it. None of it felt like it could possibly account for more than 3 hours. Yet the clock didn't lie. Almost immediately, everyone started throwing around theories. Maybe we had somehow lost track of time. Maybe we had become so distracted that we didn't realize how long we had been there. But even that explanation didn't sit right. 3 hours is a long time. You don't usually lose that much time without noticing. As we discussed it, we started walking back toward the car. The entire mood had changed. What had been a fun night suddenly felt unsettling. Every shadow looked darker. Every sound seemed louder. The walk back felt much longer than before. Then, as if the situation wasn't strange enough already, our friend's phone suddenly rang. His mom. This time, the ringtone was loud and obvious. The vibration could be clearly heard. The phone worked perfectly. Everyone heard it. Everyone saw it. For some reason, that bothered me even more. If the phone was working normally now, why hadn't any of us noticed the earlier calls? Why hadn't he? The whole thing felt impossible. At that point, I didn't know whether to laugh or panic. So, I laughed. It was one of those nervous laughs people make when they don't know how to process what's happening. Inside, though, I was genuinely unsettled. I wanted to leave. Immediately, the others felt the same way. Without discussing it much further, we started moving faster. Then we started jogging. Eventually, we were practically running. The idea of staying in those dunes any longer suddenly seemed like a terrible plan. By the time we reached the parking lot, everyone was eager to get out of there. We jumped into my car and left as fast as possible. I probably drove faster than I should have. None of us cared. We just wanted to be somewhere familiar. Eventually, we ended up back at my house. Despite acting tough, none of us wanted to be alone. Instead of going to our own rooms, we all camped out in the living room and slept close together like little kids. At the time, it seemed ridiculous, but none of us were comfortable enough to admit how freaked out we actually were. Years have passed since that night, and we still talk about it. Every time the story comes up, we revisit the same theories. Maybe we genuinely lost track of time. Maybe we were having so much fun that 30 minutes felt like 30 minutes when it was actually 3 hours. Maybe there was some simple explanation we never considered. Or maybe something stranger happened. Over the years, we've joked about alien abductions. We've joked about time slips. We've joked about glitches in reality. Of course, none of us seriously claimed to know what happened. All we know is this: I clearly remember checking my phone at 11:30 p.m. I clearly remember spending what felt like a short amount of time catching frogs near that concrete structure. And I clearly remember the shock of seeing 2:51 a.m. staring back at me from my screen. Whether it was a simple case of losing track of time or something far stranger, none of us have ever been able to explain those missing hours. And even now, whenever the story comes up, we all agree on one thing. That night in the dunes was one of the weirdest experiences any of us have ever had. For most of my life, I convinced myself that what happened when I was a child was nothing more than a nightmare. Maybe it was sleep paralysis, maybe it was an overactive imagination, maybe it was just one of those strange childhood memories that feels real, even though it never actually happened. At least, that's what I told myself. I was around 5 or 6 years old when it happened. At that age, the line between dreams and reality can sometimes feel blurry. Looking back, there are parts of the experience that seem impossible, which is why I never talked about it for years. The first incident happened late at night while I was asleep in my bedroom. I remember waking up suddenly. Everything around me seemed normal at first. My room looked the same as always, and I was lying in my bed exactly where I had fallen asleep. Then I felt something grab my legs. The sensation was immediate and unmistakable. My legs were pulled backward across the mattress. Then they were pushed forward again. At first, I thought it might be my mother playing some kind of prank. It sounds ridiculous now, but when you're a child, you don't always think logically in frightening situations. The strange thing was how real it felt. I wasn't dreaming about being moved. I physically felt the pressure on my legs. I felt the movement. I felt the mattress shifting beneath me. Eventually, whatever had happened stopped, and I somehow drifted back to sleep. The next night was far worse. That experience is the one I remembered most clearly for years. I woke up again during the night. This time, I wasn't lying still in bed. Instead, I felt myself being lifted into the air. Standing beside me was a tall, black figure. I couldn't make out any facial features. It was just a dark silhouette towering over me. Before I could react, it picked me up. Then it started moving. Fast. Incredibly fast. I remember feeling as if the figure was carrying me throughout the house at a speed that shouldn't have been possible. The walls seemed to blur. Rooms flashed by. Everything felt chaotic. As it ran, I could feel cold air rushing past me. I could feel the movement. The sensation felt completely real. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it ended. The figure threw me back onto my bed. I remember feeling the impact. The familiar thump of landing on a mattress. The bounce afterward. The feeling was exactly like jumping onto a bed from a height. That was what frightened me the most. Dreams usually fade. This didn't feel like a dream. It felt physical. It felt real. But I was a child. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been my imagination. Years passed. I never mentioned either experience to anyone. Life moved on. The memories remained tucked away in the back of my mind. Every once in a while, I would remember them and wonder what had really happened, but I always dismissed them. After all, what other explanation could there be? Then one day, years later, the topic somehow came up during a conversation with my mom. I casually told her about the strange memories from my childhood. I expected her to laugh. Maybe she would explain that I had a history of sleepwalking or vivid dreams. Instead, her reaction immediately caught my attention. She looked terrified, not confused, not amused. Terrified. The color drained from her face as I described what I remembered. When I finished talking, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked me a question. "Do you remember the camera?" At first, I had no idea what she was talking about. Then she reminded me. When I was younger, there had been a security camera installed in my room. The camera had originally been used as a monitoring device when I was very young. According to her, the recordings had been saved and stored away for years. Most of them had eventually been moved into storage in the attic. The possibility instantly sent chills through me. If the camera had been recording during those nights, there might actually be footage. For the first time in my life, I had a chance to find out whether those memories were real. Together we went looking. After searching through old storage boxes and digital files, we eventually located the recordings. At first, everything looked completely normal. We watched clip after clip. Most showed exactly what you would expect. Some recordings showed me sleeping peacefully. Others showed me tossing and turning during the night. Occasionally, my mother would appear on camera to check on me before quietly leaving the room. Nothing seemed unusual. Part of me started feeling relieved. Maybe this would finally prove that everything had been a dream. Then we reached a recording dated April 5th, 2011. The timestamp appeared in the corner of the screen. The room looked exactly as I remembered it. I watched myself sleeping peacefully beneath the blankets. For several moments, nothing happened. Then movement appeared near the window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The image seemed impossible, but the movement continued. Slowly, a man climbed through my bedroom window. My heart nearly stopped. Even now, remembering that moment makes me uncomfortable. The man wasn't someone I recognized. He wasn't a family member. He wasn't anyone I had ever seen before. He crawled into the room carefully and quietly. Then he approached my bed. I couldn't look away from the screen. The man bent down and picked me up, exactly like I remembered. For years, I had believed I was recalling a nightmare. Yet there it was. The footage showed him lifting me from the bed. Then he began running. The camera view became chaotic as he moved around the room at an almost unbelievable speed. Everything happened exactly as I remembered. When he was finished, he returned me to the bed. Not gently. He tossed me onto the mattress. My body bounced slightly from the impact. The same impact I remembered feeling years earlier. The same sensation I had convinced myself was a dream. At that point, I expected him to leave. Instead, he stayed. For nearly 20 minutes, the man simply stood there, watching me, not speaking, not moving much, just standing in the darkness, staring. The longer it went on, the more disturbing it became. There was something deeply wrong about the way he stood there. The stillness, the patience, the fact that he seemed completely comfortable, remaining in a child's bedroom in the middle of the night. Then something happened that made the footage even harder to watch. Eventually, the man turned toward the camera. It was almost as if he had suddenly noticed it. For several moments, he stared directly into the lens. Then he smiled. A slow, unsettling smile. According to the timestamp, he remained facing the camera for roughly 2 minutes. The entire time, he appeared to be grinning. At one point, he even licked his lips. The gesture was strangely deliberate, as though he knew someone would eventually watch the footage, as though he wanted whoever found the recording to know he had seen the camera all along. Even writing about it now makes me uncomfortable. Finally, after several more moments, the man walked back toward the window. He climbed out, then disappeared into the darkness. The footage ended. Neither my mother nor I spoke for a long time afterward. We simply sat there staring at the screen. I had spent years believing those childhood memories were dreams. Instead, I had apparently discovered something far more disturbing. To this day, I have no idea who that man was. I don't know how he entered the property. I don't know why he came into my room. I don't know why he picked me up. And I definitely don't know why he spent 20 minutes standing there watching me sleep. What troubles me most is the fact that he seemed completely aware of the camera, almost amused by it, as if being recorded didn't concern him at all. Years have passed since then, yet the memory still haunts me. Not just the footage itself, but the realization that sometimes the things we dismiss as childhood nightmares may have roots in something much darker. I still don't know who that man was. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to find out. When I was about 9 years old, I had an experience that scared me so badly it affected me for years afterward. Even today, decades later, I still think about that night sometimes and wonder what really happened. At the time, one of my friends had recently moved into a house only a few blocks away from mine. She hadn't lived there very long, but I had already been over a few times. Another friend, who was about a year younger than us and lived across the street, was also spending the night. Like most kids, we thought having a sleepover was the greatest thing in the world. Everything seemed completely normal at first. As the evening went on, someone suggested that we sleep in the attic area above the garage. For some reason, all three of us thought it sounded fun. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure why. The space wasn't particularly cozy or inviting. It wasn't one of those finished attic bedrooms you see in movies. It was simply a small room above the garage that was used mostly for storage. A set of stairs led directly up into it. There was no door at the top of the stairs, no way to close it off, just an open staircase leading into a dim room filled with stored belongings. There was a bed pushed against one wall, along with boxes and random items scattered around the room. At the time, though, none of that seemed creepy. It just felt like an adventure. When it came time to go to sleep, all three of us squeezed into the same bed. Unfortunately, I got the worst position. One friend, M, slept in the middle. The other friend, C, slept against the wall. That left me on the outside edge of the bed, nearest the open room. I hated it immediately. Even as a kid, I was easily frightened at night. The darkness felt different when you were away from home. Every little noise sounded louder. Every shadow looked suspicious. I remember pulling the blanket up over my head. I always slept that way when I was nervous. Even now, as an adult, I still have certain sleeping habits that started back then. One of them was that I always needed one foot sticking out from under the blankets. For some reason, I couldn't sleep comfortably otherwise. That night was no exception. My head was covered, one foot was sticking out, and eventually, both of my friends drifted off to sleep. I was still awake. Not fully awake, maybe, but not asleep either. You know that strange state where you're right on the edge of falling asleep. That's where I was. Then I felt something touch my foot. At first, I thought it was one of my friends moving around, but the sensation continued. Slowly, deliberately, something was touching my foot, then my ankle, then my lower leg. The hand seemed to be feeling its way up and down, almost as if whoever or whatever it belonged to was trying to figure out what they were touching. I froze instantly. Every muscle in my body locked up. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The hand felt rough. In my memory, it felt hairy. I remember feeling what seemed like fingernails against my skin. Of course, I was only 9 years old, so maybe my terrified brain exaggerated some of those details. But the fear itself was absolutely real. The realization hit me all at once. Something was under the bed. Someone was under the bed. The thought was so horrifying that I couldn't even scream. I simply lay there, paralyzed. Then things became even worse. The person started climbing out. I couldn't see them directly because the blanket covered most of my face. However, there was a small gap between the blanket and my body that allowed me to see movement. I watched as a figure emerged beside the bed. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The person began touching the blanket, patting it, slowly pressing against it, almost as if they were checking where we were lying beneath it. The movements felt deliberate, exploratory. I remember hearing breathing, heavy breathing, labored breathing, the kind of breathing someone makes after physical exertion or after drinking heavily. The person didn't seem steady on their feet either. I could hear small stumbles and awkward movements as they stood beside the bed. Every second felt endless. I kept waiting for them to grab me, or pull the blanket away, or do something worse. Then something unexpected happened. My friend M suddenly rolled over. At least that's what it looked like. While seemingly asleep, her arm swung outward and smacked directly into the person standing beside the bed. The figure stumbled backward. I remember hearing them lose their balance. For a second, there was silence. Then, the person recovered and slowly began moving away from the bed, toward the stairs. I remained frozen. I still didn't move. I still didn't speak. I listened as they carefully descended the staircase. Once they reached the garage below, new sounds started. Metal clinking, objects shifting, drawers opening. It sounded as though they were rummaging through tools or equipment. The previous owner of the property had operated a bicycle repair business out of the garage, so there were always tools stored there. The noises continued for a few moments. Then I heard something that confirmed the person had left. The garage door opened. A small bell attached to the door rang. Then it rang again as the door closed. The sound echoed through the garage. The person was gone. Still, I didn't move. I lay there completely terrified for what felt like forever. Then something surprising happened. M suddenly sat up. I sat up too, and that's when she told me she had been awake the entire time. The arm swing wasn't an accident. She had intentionally hit whoever was standing beside the bed. The moment she said that, any lingering hope that I had imagined the entire thing disappeared. We had both experienced it. Without wasting another second, we jumped out of bed and ran down the stairs. Unfortunately, our friend C remained asleep through almost everything. She was completely knocked out. M and I ran directly to her parents' bedroom. We burst inside and woke her father. Her younger brother, who had Down syndrome, was sleeping in the room with him as usual. Through tears and panic, we explained what had happened. At first, I don't think he fully understood. But once he saw how frightened we were, he grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. Together, we returned to the attic room. He woke C and checked the entire area. He looked under the bed. He searched the room. Of course, nobody was there anymore. We already knew that. We had heard the person leave. Still, what he found made the situation even more disturbing. Under the bed were several empty miniature liquor bottles. The small airline-sized bottles often sold in liquor stores. Someone had clearly been drinking up there. Then he discovered something else. There was a hole in the wall overlooking the kitchen below. The more everyone thought about it, the more disturbing it became. M came from a large Latino family. She had 4 or 5 older sisters, all of whom were teenagers or young adults. Although most of them weren't home that night, they were usually around during the day. The kitchen was one of the main gathering places in the house. It didn't take much imagination to figure out why someone might create a hole overlooking that area. The realization was horrifying. Someone had likely been living up there, watching, spying, maybe for days, maybe longer. That possibility scared me far more than any childhood monster ever could. The rest of us spent the remainder of the night sleeping together in the living room. Or at least, everyone else slept. I don't think I closed my eyes once. The second sunlight started coming through the windows. I grabbed my bike and left. I pedaled home as fast as I could. When I arrived, I discovered that my mom had locked the front door. Back then, we almost never locked our doors, so that was unusual. I knew she would be angry that I came home early. Worse, she would ask questions. Questions I didn't want to answer. Because I knew exactly what would happen if I told her. She would never let me go back. So instead of knocking, I climbed into our car parked outside and curled up on the floor of the back seat. I waited there until my mom came outside to get the morning newspaper, and even then, I never told her the truth. Not that day. Not ever. As a child, I convinced myself a monster had crawled out from under the bed. But as I got older, I realized the truth was probably far more realistic and far more frightening. It may have been a homeless person. It may have been someone hiding there to avoid being seen. It may have been someone spying on the family. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the experience affected me for years. Until I got married, I refused to sleep in beds with open space underneath them. My box spring sat directly on the floor. I couldn't stand the idea of something being able to hide beneath me while I slept. Even now, one question still bothers me. Why did the person leave? Why, after touching my foot and standing beside our bed, did they suddenly decide to walk away? Was it because M hit them? Were they startled? Were they simply drunk and confused? Or were they looking for something in the garage? A tool, a weapon, something else entirely. I'll never know. But sometimes, not knowing is the part that stays with you the longest. This happened a long time ago when I was still a kid, but it's one of those memories that has stuck with me because of how strange and unsettling it felt at the time. One day, my mom and one of her friends decided to meet up at a mall. Their plan was to sit together at a restaurant and catch up while my friend and I entertained ourselves. The mall wasn't very large. In fact, it was small enough that there was almost no chance of getting lost. Because of that, our parents didn't worry too much about us walking around on our own. At first, my friend and I were just wandering through the mall talking about random things. We were bored and looking for something interesting to do while our moms spent time together. As we walked around, we unexpectedly ran into a girl from our school. I didn't know her very well, but it was obvious that my friend did. The two of them immediately started talking, and before long, the three of us were hanging out together. Eventually, we made our way toward the back section of the mall. That area was usually quieter than the rest of the building. There weren't many stores nearby, and very few people walked through that part of the mall. While exploring, we noticed something unusual. There was an open window leading into a section of the mall that appeared to be abandoned. Naturally, our curiosity took over. From what we could tell, the abandoned area had once been some kind of gymnastics center or sports facility. It looked like a place where people might have trained or attended classes years earlier. The strange thing was that it wasn't completely demolished. It seemed as though there had once been plans to reopen it, but for whatever reason, the project had never been finished. The area had simply been left sitting there, untouched. To a group of curious kids, it looked like the perfect place to explore. The girl volunteered to go first. Since the window was already open, she climbed through and disappeared inside. My friend and I stayed outside while she checked the area. The plan was simple. She would look around and see if there was another entrance we could use instead of climbing through the window. While we waited, something happened that immediately made me uncomfortable. I heard a sound behind us. Instinctively, I turned around. For just a second, I saw someone standing nearby. The figure was watching us. The sight lasted only a moment before they disappeared from view. At first, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then, I looked at my friend. The expression on his face told me everything. He had seen it too. Neither of us said anything right away. We just exchanged a glance. There was no need to explain. We both knew someone had been standing there watching us. A few moments later, the girl returned. She said she had found a proper entrance and that it was safe to come inside. Despite the strange encounter outside, our curiosity got the better of us. We followed her into the abandoned area. The moment We stepped inside. I realized the place was much larger than I expected. The building seemed to stretch farther than it appeared from outside. Dust covered everything. Old equipment and abandoned items were scattered throughout the rooms. Some areas looked untouched for years. There were tools lying around, broken furniture, and various pieces of equipment that probably shouldn't have been left there. The atmosphere immediately felt creepy, not because of ghosts or anything supernatural. It was simply the feeling of being somewhere forgotten, somewhere people weren't supposed to be. As we explored, we occasionally heard sounds from deeper inside the building. At first, we assumed it was the building settling. Then we heard what sounded like footsteps. The noises would appear suddenly and then stop. Every time we heard them, we paused and listened. But whenever we tried to figure out where they were coming from, everything would go quiet again. The sounds made us increasingly nervous. Part of me kept thinking about the person we had seen outside. The deeper we went, the more uncomfortable I became. Eventually, we discovered a staircase leading to another floor. Naturally, we decided to investigate. The second level looked much like the first. More abandoned equipment, more empty rooms, more evidence that the facility had been left unused for a very long time. Then, we found something that disturbed us more than anything else in the building. In one corner of an otherwise empty area was a mattress. Just a single mattress sitting by itself. At first glance, that might not sound unusual, but considering where we were, it felt completely out of place. Nobody should have been living there, yet the mattress suggested otherwise. The possibility immediately entered our minds. What if someone actually lived inside the abandoned section of the mall? Suddenly, all the strange sounds made more sense. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched, the figure outside. The mattress made it seem possible that someone had been using the place as a shelter. The realization sent a chill through me. Up until that point, exploring had felt exciting. Now, it felt dangerous. We continued looking around, but none of us felt quite as brave anymore. Eventually, we found another exit. Using it, we left the abandoned area and unexpectedly emerged onto the second floor of the mall itself. Relieved to be back in a public area, we started walking away. That's when we saw him again. A man was standing nearby. I couldn't get a good look at him. The sighting lasted only a moment, but there was something unsettling about him, something familiar. It felt like he might have been the same person we had seen earlier, the same figure who had been watching us outside. The same person we suspected might have been inside the abandoned building. Before we could get a better look, he disappeared. The entire encounter left us feeling uneasy. We quickly returned to the normal parts of the mall and eventually made our way back to our mothers. Later, my friend finally admitted something. He told me that when we were outside waiting for the girl, he had definitely seen the figure watching us. He hadn't imagined it. Neither had I. Someone had been there. To this day, I still don't know who that person was. Maybe he was a homeless man living in the abandoned section of the mall. Maybe he was a security guard keeping an eye on trespassers. Or maybe he was simply someone passing through who happened to notice us. Whatever the truth was, the mattress, the footsteps, and the repeated sightings made the whole experience feel far more disturbing than a simple exploration of an abandoned building. Even now, years later, I still wonder who was watching us that day. And more importantly, why he seemed to appear everywhere we went.